Hello everyone, this is going to be 18.2, continuing on with the Progressive Era. We're going to look at women's rights during this time, and we're also going to look at the progressive movement in politics as well. So we're going to start with the primary source that says, if you want to make enemies, try to change something. That's from Woodrow Wilson, who we'll talk about later. Now let's talk about the politics of progressivism. So the Gilded Age had been, for a long time, the time of minimal government intrusion, what they called laissez-faire economics, the idea that the government that runs best is the one that runs least, that doesn't interfere with people's lives very much. In general, the government had been seen as more of a hindrance, as a burden. However, progressives took the opposing viewpoint. They thought that America has a lot of big problems. We need a big government to fix them as well. And this was based upon the progressive movements in Europe, where they believed that progressives should welcome government intervention instead of shun it. Part of this was a theory of what is called pragmatism. That is, according to this, you shouldn't base the success of something based on its religious doctrine or political beliefs. It should be hard science based on how successful something was. So it's almost like a science experiment. You don't base it on like whether it's religiously moral or something like that. Instead, pragmatists said, try a whole lot of options, see what works best, see what has the best outcome for the most people, and this is the best way to make society better, instead of through political or religious dogma. So you can be an optimist and say the glass is half full, you can be a pessimist and say the glass is half empty, or you can be a pragmatist and just drink the drink of water, I'm sure. So, much of the progressive reform started at the local and the state level, especially since the idea that big government can be good was still a growing idea. City-based progressives worked to overthrow the power of political machines, like Boss Tweed again, making sure that people didn't have to pay too much for their gas and water bills, and providing public transportation. Now, they did all this by raising property taxes, which went towards public schools and public parks. Also, some of the local mayors would go on to become governors as well, where they continued this progressive fight. Now, while you might think of progressivism as like a Western thing, there are also a lot of progressives in the East, and if you are keeping count of the number of times I say progressive, it's going to be in the billions by the time I'm done with this section. A lot of these progressives are ex-populists working against big government, or I'm sorry, not big government, but working against big railroad corporations and corruption in politics. We see progressive governors like Hiram Johnson of California and Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. But however, one of the most important was out of Oregon, where a guy named William U'Ren of Oregon started Western progressivism. He advocated for what is known as the Oregon system of government, which included a lot more power to the people to make choices that would impact the government. We'll take a look at a few of these. But first, here's Robert Fightin' Bob La Follette, who said, men must be aggressive for what is right if government is to be saved from men who are aggressive for what is wrong. He chose a cabinet full of experts from the University of Wisconsin to be his cabinet. And this was another idea of the progressive movement at the time, which is don't elect politicians, elect experts, and the experts should be the ones to do things. He also fought against railroad and lumber monopolies in Wisconsin. And here's Hiram Johnson, who protested World War I by saying the first casualty of war is truth. And he fought against the corrupt railroad monopolies of California and got the working hours in California down to 8 hours a day, and wears a very nice tie in that picture. Now, the three major points of the Oregon system, which we still use today, are the initiative, the referendum, and the political recall. An initiative is when citizens have the right to propose laws. Basically, if you walk around with a clipboard and get enough signatures, you can get your law put on the ballot and have people vote for whether they want it or not. The referendum required certain pieces of law passed by lawmakers to go in front of the people to be approved. And lastly, the political recall allowed for the removal of some, not all, but some elected leaders by popular vote. So if you felt that your mayor was corrupt, you could again sign a petition and get the mayor kicked out of his office early, before the allotted time. So these all aim to take power away from political bosses and machines and corrupt officials and put it in the hands of the people. In Western states, initiatives were how many of the women got the right to vote before the 19th Amendment. Now, this is an example of an actual honest to goodness initiative that I saw while in Maplewood. Sometimes when I get asked to sign one, I might ask them to pose for a picture just because I'm so excited. She was very polite and said yes. Now, the progressive era also attempted to give more people the power to elect their elected leaders. The 17th Amendment passed during this time, which allowed people to vote for their senators. That happened. However, as we've already seen, there was downside to this too, where African Americans in the South lost a lot of their ability to vote for things thanks to literacy tests and violence and people deciding who was fit and who was not to vote. Now, while still not allowed to vote in the most part, women were calling for greater democracy in America, small d democracy, through grassroots movement and protests. The most well known female reformer of the time was a woman named Jane Addams, the founder of Hull House in Chicago. Hull House being a settlement house which offered social services to poor immigrants. It was This was not women, sort of running the house from afar. This was women running it up close and getting personal with the people that they were helping. They offered schooling, they helped with employment, and they opened health clinics to both women and children of this time. And soon there were over 400 settlement houses throughout America, including Hull House in Chicago. And here's Jane Addams, 1860 to 1935, from Illinois, where she was from a relatively well-to-do, middle to upper class family. She was a social worker and a political activist and won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. By many in the modern LGBTQ plus movement, she's also seen as an icon. She lived with the same woman for over 40 years, and even though it's unknown if this was a relationship, it was a rejection of the traditional gender norms that had been placed upon her. Now, Adams is part of a larger group of, we're seeing a lot more well educated women. We're seeing new colleges like Bryn Mawr and Vassar open during this time. And so they were sometimes thought of as the tip of the spear, the spearheads for reform. They fought for things like better housing, better health care. They fought for against government corruption. They also enabled new leaders like Jane Addams and Florence Kelley, who helped to create the National Consumers League and helped factory workers get better working conditions. Now, the increase in education and also the number of female progressives involved in this helped push forward the suffrage movement as well. So the National American Women's Suffrage Association had over 2 million members by 1917. And they did have some early success in getting women the right to vote in Western states. Oftentimes, getting female women, getting women elected mayor and sometimes governor, and we're seeing the first congressman coming out of the West as well. And eventually they shifted their goal towards, look, it's really hard to do this state by state. Let's make it a national thing instead. So here is Nellie Taylor Ross from Wyoming, the first female governor. She was appointed the head of the U.S. Mint by FDR as well. And here is Jeannette Rankin from Montana, the first female congressman from 1917 to 19 and 41 through 43. She was a female rights activist, a suffragist, and a total pacifist. She voted against both World War I and World War II, and in fact, she was the only member of the House and Senate to vote against World War II. This is her statue in Statuary Hall in Congress. Now, some of the suffrage movement received support because it was linked to the idea of this is sort of the job of women, what is called maternalist reform. They're offering money and education for women to help them with their child rearing. Another interesting victory for women was Mueller versus Oregon, where in this case the Supreme Court gave women a shorter work week. However, it was portrayed almost as a defeat because they were shown or at least they were portrayed as being weak, unable to do the same amount of work, and in need of protection. Now, let's lastly look at the progressive presidents of this time period. So, progressive movement may have started at the local and state level, but it worked up towards the national level. This was a time where American nationalism was growing, and we see leading the charge for national progressivism were Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, a Republican, and a Democrat, respectively. Now, Teddy Roosevelt became president when Willie McKinley was assassinated. He was McKinley's VP. And Roosevelt was manic and energetic. He believed in living what he called the strenuous life, both privately and politically. He saw himself also as a steward of the people. He thought his job was to speak for the people as president, and he created a political agenda deeply rooted in progressivism. So here's our 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt, uh, president from 1901 to '09. He's born in New York City. He's a New York assemblyman, a former assistant secretary of the Navy, governor of New York, and vice president. He was also America's youngest president at 42, and the first president to win a Nobel Peace Prize, although we've had a few now who've done that. Now, Roosevelt called his plan what for America the Square Deal. He saw it as offering a fair chance at success for all men, not necessarily helping the poor, but helping the poor have the same shot as a rich man. He also took aim at big corporations, trying to remove the bad trusts as he saw them, the bad corporations that hurt their customers, and keeping the good corporations like Carnegie Steel, which in his mind served the public good. Now, quickly after taking office, he started to persecute the bad trusts. He went after J.P. Morgan, one of the richest men in the world, and a personal ally of the Roosevelt family. His company ran a railroad monopoly along with the banks in the East Coast, and in 1904, the Supreme Court ordered it to be broken apart. This really came as a shock to a lot of people. So here's Teddy Roosevelt hunting and killing the bad trusts while keeping the good trust restrained. Roosevelt also used the presidency to act as a negotiator between workers and managers. He saw himself as basically a neutral third party in things like coal disputes. He also threatened to bring in the army if they didn't settle their dispute as well. He passed the Hepburn Act, which gave teeth to the Interstate Commerce Commission to really set shipping rates. He also passed the Pure Food and Drug Act to make sure that the labels on the medicine were what they said they were, and also passed the Meat Inspection Act to make sure that our food is safe and delicious. Now, Roosevelt was also an avid outdoorsman. He loved the outdoors. He loved nature. He was a hunter. He also was inspired, or at least sort of moved, by a man named John Muir, who was a Scottish immigrant who had settled in Yosemite Valley after a while. Muir helped to form the Sierra Club to stop American industries from destroying our wilderness, and he was what we would call a preservationist. He wanted beautiful parts of our country and our wilderness to remain untouched. Muir's transcendentalist viewpoint of nature, that nature is where you find God, made him a very popular and passionate speaker, and he helped to sort of lead Roosevelt towards conservation reform. So here's John Muir with Teddy Roosevelt at Yosemite National Park. Muir was alive from 1838 to 1914. He was born in Scotland. He immigrated to America early on. He was an author and a naturalist and a preservationist. He nearly lost his sight in an industrial accident. He was nearly blinded, and that gave him a lot more respect for the beauty of nature. He went on to found the Sierra Club to help preserve America's nature, and he once lived in a one-room cabin in Yosemite with a creek running through the middle of it. He once said also, "I'd rather be in the mountains thinking of God than in a church thinking about the mountains." So, Roosevelt used his presidential power for both preservation and conservation to protect things from extermination, but also to save them for later. He and his good friend, the head of the forestry division, was a guy named Gifford Pinchot. Um, Gifford Pinchot helped to inspire the conservation movement, which is, in some cases, trying to preserve the beautiful parts of our nation, but also trying to sustainably manage our natural resources and save them for later. The preservation of natural beauty was for everybody and forever. Meanwhile, conservation is the idea of like we can't use up all of our resources at once. We got to save some for the next generation. Uh, One of the most important resources was water, especially in the West. And we see that this is one of the areas where preservation and conservation sort of bashed heads. John Muir wanted the Hetch Hetchy Valley to be preserved as it was. However, Roosevelt let it be flooded so that San Francisco could have drinking water. Now, Roosevelt had served almost 8 years in office and he decided not to run in 1908. However, he pointed to his friend William Howard Taft and said, "This is your guy." Taft beat William Jennings Bryan. Of course, everybody beat William Jennings Bryan for the presidency, and was seen more conservative than Roosevelt. However, he was a bigger trust buster than Roosevelt. Taft did not see the distinction between good and bad trusts. Taft also supported the 16th Amendment, which allowed for a progressive income tax that was eventually passed under the next guy who followed him, Woodrow Wilson. And so here is William Howard Taft, president from 1909 to 1913, from Ohio, where he was a former judge. He was a governor of the Philippines and of Cuba, and also Roosevelt's Secretary of War. He is also our largest president we've ever had, over 350 pounds. Although his weight dipped, he was very depressed when he was president of the United States. He kind of hated that job. And however, when he left office, he dropped by about 100 pounds. He's also the only president we've ever had who became the head of another branch of government when he was done being president. He became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So, also, there's the famous story of his bathtub was big enough to have 4 men, and I envy his Taft tub. Sure, we'll go with that. Taft did anger, however, many progressives. He lowered tariffs, however, not as much as people wanted. He also fired Gifford Pinchot, who was a very close friend of Teddy Roosevelt's. This bothered Roosevelt to the point where Roosevelt decided he'd made a mistake in leaving office and decided to run again as the president of the candidate of the Progressive Party in 1912, a new third party, sometimes called the Bull Moose Party, because somebody asked Roosevelt, "How do you feel?" And he said, "I feel as strong as a bull moose." So here's Gifford Pinchot, who said, "The purpose of conservation, the greatest good to the greatest number of people for the longest time." Now, in 1912, there was a four-way race, and it really was a question of the future of progressivism and the nature of it. Taft ran as sort of a conservative progressive, doing progressive things but slowly and carefully. On the opposite side is Eugene Debs, calling for a massive overhaul of the U.S. government, allowing the government to control big business and asking for many other socialist goals. So these are the two extremes. And in the middle, there's Teddy Roosevelt again and Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic nominee. Both are progressive, but with differing ideas of what should be done with progressivism. And they battled it out over this idea of progressive reform. And remember, all four of these guys would be labeled as progressive. Even Taft, the most conservative, would be considered way on the left of the progressive movement today if he were still alive. Now, Wilson favored getting rid of big corporations, thinking that all big corporations hurt competition and competition was important for economic growth. He called for new freedom, calling for stronger antitrust laws and protecting the union's right to organize, and also encouraging small business growth. Wilson thought that he could do this without the government directly sort of messing with the economy too much. Roosevelt, on the other hand, called for new nationalism, where he said the government should be heavy handed in intervening. He wanted to impose heavy taxes on corporations, and he wanted the regulation of industries like railroads. The Progressive Party of this time also promoted the idea of social justice and social welfare through big government, that we should have women's suffrage and unemployment coverage and medical care coverage and shorter work weeks. And a lot of these didn't happen under Roosevelt, of course, because he didn't win. Some didn't happen under Wilson, but we do see that a lot of these would inspire future progressive movements of the 40s and the 60s and even in the 90s. So here's the difference between Roosevelt and Wilson. I thought this might be a better way to help you kind of see the difference between the two. Now, the fact that Roosevelt and Taft sort of split the Republican Party and the vote for the Republicans, this allowed Woodrow Wilson to win with about 43% of the popular vote. Wilson was seen as a very strong executive leader. He wanted his face to be seen. He spoke directly to Congress instead of sending them notes, which everyone had done since John Adams. He also held regular press conferences trying to get the press to deliver his message to the people. So here's our 28th president, Woodrow Wilson, president from 1913 to 1921. He is from Virginia, but he lived a lot of his life in New Jersey, where he was the president of Princeton and a former governor of New Jersey. He also suffered a stroke while he was president after World War II. I'm sorry, World War One, and some say that his wife actually took over for him and ran the government in secret in his place. Now, Wilson followed, again, a progressive route. Again, all of these guys were progressives. He lowered taxes on foreign goods and made up the difference by going after big business. He got the Clayton Act of 1914 signed, which stopped the prosecution of unions and defended the union's right to organize. He created the 8-hour workday and signed laws that stopped child labor. He even was a bit of a populist, a big P populist. He helped farmers get government credit for their crops as long as they put the crops into government warehouses. Now, Wilson's presidency also continued to expand the power of big government. He cut back on the idea of trust busting, but instead made it so that the government made the government the power, gave them the power to supervise American businesses. He also created the Federal Reserve, a group of national banks across the country run by the U.S. government to issue currency and help failing banks and influence interest rates. And lastly, he established the Federal Trade Commission to investigate and curtail unfair business practices like monopolies and price gouging. Here, by the way, is the Federal Reserve we have in St. Louis, downtown. And so by 1916, we see that the progressive movement had reshaped American democracy. There are new laws, new agencies, the government is doing lots of big progressive things, and this was a big change in the way that America worked. However, we're going to see a test of American progressivism when we get involved in a big foreign war overseas in World War I in 1917.